Oliver, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
And I was really pleased to get this one booked in because you're a man that really respects his time and is quite conscious of how he spends it. When did that become the case that you became somebody that was a little bit more focused on just how he's spending his time and how it's passing?
That's a good question. I think there's sort of two ways to answer it. One is there's definitely like a life cycle thing, right? It's definitely a bit more of a midlife thought than a young life thought. So, when I was 20, I did not give very much thought to the finite nature of time, and now I'm in my 40s. I certainly do. But there's also just this fact that I think on some level I've always sort of had some struggle, some psychodrama with time and whether I'm using it properly and what it says about me if I'm not using it properly, and all these kind of tangled things best discussed with a therapist, really. And the book that I wrote on time, the first book I wrote on time, 4,000 Weeks, really emerged from that, right? It's like I need to write the advice that I need to hear. So it's not so much that I'm really good at being thoughtful and calm and focused about my time, but that it's a special struggle for me. so that's what sort of motivated me to go deep into it. And I think that's often the case with people offering advice or self-help or stuff, right? It's their issues that they're exploring on some level.
Absolutely. And I think something I've learned over the past 4 years of podcasting is when you teach something else onto somebody else, it's a great way to relearn and reinforce the lessons for yourself too.
Yeah,
And
totally.
like the mark of a charlatan, somebody that can't really explain why they do what they do or how they do it. But the mark of somebody who really knows their topic is that they can take fairly complex ideas and information and distill it down into something that's understandable, not necessarily for the layman, but for somebody that doesn't spend all day, every day obsessing or poring over this particular area. Can I take an idea or a concept and distill it down and somebody be like, okay, I understand how that works and I understand how that might be applicable to my thought process or my day or my routine or something that I do.
Right, totally. I think it's much more valuable. I've got more to offer if I've like been through this stuff and found it hard, and then just had the time and because of the good fortune of the job I have to look really go into it deep, than if I sort of presented myself as somebody who always had it nailed and like had no trouble with it. When I think about the things that I have never had any trouble with in life, and I think this is true for everyone, they're not very interesting to me, right? They're not the things that I really want to try and crack the puzzle of because they've just always come naturally. And using time well and being productive and not being distracted and not procrastinating is not something that has come naturally and easily to me. So,
What do you think were some of the big mistakes or errors that you were making when it came to how you were spending your time?
I mean, just to go right into the sort of philosophy of it, I think the sort of umbrella issue, the deep thing, is that in some way I was, and I think lots of people fall into this trap. I was sort of constantly thinking that I was working towards a future point at which I would, and people have different ways of expressing this themselves, be on top of everything, be in control of everything, have everything running smoothly, have sort of proved myself to be a worthy human being, have my life in working order. There's a million different nuances depending on your personality, right? But this basic idea that like I'm working to a moment of truth when it's all going to be like plug and play, plain sailing, life works from then on. And the problems with this are, firstly, the definition that we use for that is actually something that you couldn't ever have, right? So if it's like being able to handle literally every demand that's placed on you, being able to pursue literally every ambition that you could come up with, well, that's just maths. So that's not going to happen. We're finite. Those realms are infinite. So we're not going to get there. But also it gives this kind of really provisional feeling to the actual life that is unfolding, right? So you think you're being very good and thoughtful about time, and you're very focused on using it well and being really efficient and all the rest of it. But the result, the ironic result, is that you end up sort of treating your present life as something to try to get through, get it out of the way to this time that's going to come in the future. And, you know, I'm certainly not against having long-term, big, ambitious goals and visions and projects and stuff. We can totally talk about that. I think the thing we need to remember and find ways to remember is that that's got to have some, even those long-term projects, even those big, far-off goals, they've got to have some sense of meaning and aliveness, like right now. They can't all just be like, this isn't real life. Like real life's going to begin.
Life isn't a dress rehearsal, and that's what I
Exactly. Yeah.
always think
Yeah.
about when I listen to you discuss this or I read about you discuss this, because it, like you say, it can be quite a challenging thought, particularly when I, for many times in the podcast, have encouraged delayed gratification in some
Yeah.
regards. And I
Yeah.
think we live in an instant gratification culture, but the kind of
Yeah.
people that dial into a podcast like this one on a weekly basis are probably more susceptible to delay, delay, delay. What's coming in the future will be utopia. I'll have more free time.
Right.
I'll be happy when, etc., etc. Like, you can expand out on either two of those. And I really think that when somebody like yourself is encouraging somebody to spend their time consciously and not almost, I think it seems like it's preparatory sometimes. Like, I'm preparing for
Yeah. Yeah.
when life will be a particular way, and there's every chance that that never comes. And I suppose, as you mentioned, with from an age perspective, sometimes by 40 or whatever age, you maybe realize that, oh, I mean, I thought by 40 this would be the case or that would be the case, and
Right.
as is increasingly becoming the case, that's not the case for, particularly for my generation. Like, as a, like, kind of, I'm kind of an early millennial. 1992 I was born.
Okay. Right.
Many people in my age of 30, 31 are not living the lives that they may be expected based on what had come before them, in terms of people are getting married later, people having children
Yeah.
later, people
Yeah.
are getting their first house later.
Right.
And that definitely links into the whole, oh, I'm preparing for what's coming
Yeah.
next. And that sometimes is what the next thing seems like it should be.
I think you're spot on. I think you've really nailed it there. I think the sort of nuance that I'd add is it's not just that, like, these, it's true, right? These external world things, you don't want to make your life dependent on them. So, like, telling yourself that life is really going to begin when you've bought a house puts you completely at the mercy of the insane things happening in the housing market, right? That's not having an autonomous life. That's saying, when these wild macroeconomic forces align, then maybe I can have a fulfilled life. But it's also just that, see if how to express this, but like the whole stance that you're working towards a moment of truth in the future, like, has the effect of reducing the meaningfulness of your life in the present. So I think it's a difficult idea to convey sometimes, because there's a version of this in our culture that suggests that therefore all you should do is just sort of float around passively through life and do some yoga and meditation, but not really try to achieve anything, because what's the point? Life is all in the present. And I'm always trying to, and in the book I've just got coming out shortly, which we can talk about, if I'd certainly like to talk about,
Yeah.
I'm really trying to focus in on this idea that no, actually confronting your limitations, understanding what it means to be finite, accepting the fact that this right here is life and not a dress rehearsal, this actually goes along with taking big, bold actions and accomplishing stuff and being really sort of meaningfully productive in the world. It isn't an opposition. It isn't like either I'm productive or I embrace the moment. You don't need to settle for one and not the other.
I think, as you say, it goes hand in hand, it goes together, and it's not necessarily in conflict, despite maybe when you initially hear that phrase of, like, well, maybe you should live a little bit more in the moment just now and not just think about
Right.
tomorrow. You aren't, as you say, you are not advocating for maybe a more nihilistic view where, well, what does it matter anyway? It's
Right.
just
Yeah.
going to, what is going to be will be. That's not the case. We do have an element of agency and control over some things, but not as much as sometimes we like to give ourselves credit for.
Yeah. And I think that, you know, you were saying before about deferring gratification, and there's this big sort of narrative about taking decisions in the service of your future self and all this stuff.
Yep.
And it's totally right. And there are plenty of people in the world who could do with a bit more of that lesson. But there is this selection effect problem, which is that the people who are drawn to that, I assume also the audience for this and for your work, you know, are almost the least likely to have a big problem with that. And I'm talking about myself here as well, right? I'm not someone who grew up having a big terrible problem with putting things off and working hard for future results. I'm someone who went a bit too far in that direction, and not only does it sort of make life no fun, but it actually gets in the way of doing the work and achieving the results, because it encourages you to sort of approach life as a big fight and assume that every big important project is really difficult and it's going to take it out of you, and you're like, okay, but I'm mentally strong enough, and for some people like physically strong enough to sort of beat my way through this. And it turns it into a drama that it doesn't need to be. It triggers procrastination in a lot of people, because who wants to spend every single day in this stance of like fighting life? And quite often the answer to getting more done is to be kinder to yourself. But I am exactly the kind of person who reads advice on like self-compassion and just wants to die of cringe, right? That's like, I don't like that. It's like, don't give me that woo-woo stuff about self-care. I want to like actually get things done. And so it's been a bit of a difficult journey for me to realize that actually maybe in some sense, like letting things be easy, allowing yourself not to sort of yell internally at yourself all day long to get more done, and to it might actually be productive as well as sort of friendlier towards
The
oneself.
term from your work that stands out to me in that regard is surrendering to the reality of time.
Right.
How do you recommend somebody does that successfully?
Yeah, that's the question. I mean, I think reality, the phrasing and the idea of reality is a useful one here, because I'm just guessing. But if people watching, listening to this are like me, or like I was some years ago, because they may well be younger, as I said, all sorts of words like self-compassion and all this sort of stuff may not necessarily resonate very much. But facing reality, that seems like a good thing to do, right? That seems like quite a bold and it's the kind of thing you want to do. Nobody wants to sort of think that they're only getting by because they are deluding themselves about what reality is. But actually they lead to the same destination, right? Because the reality is that you are finite, that you have a certain amount of time on the planet, a certain amount of time in the day, a certain amount of control over how the day unfolds. And if you decide to get married or certainly have kids, you'll have even less control with every sort of passing phase of this. And then, in old age, people really start to lack control over what they can be confident they're able to do and things like that. So we've got this incredible finitude. And I think a lot of what we are trying to do when we try to really sort of optimize and get more and more efficient about stuff is we're trying to sort of build up the psychological power to ignore that fact. But it's still true and it's still reality. So it doesn't work very well, and all sorts of bad things happen, which we can talk about when you try to sort of pursue life on the basis that you don't have limitations. And so what I'm arguing for a lot of the time is, if you surrender to the reality of your limitations, and I know you asked about how to do that, and let's get onto that if you like, but if you can live more sort of authentically in the fact that you have limited time, limited control over how things unfold, you don't end up having a more limited life, right? You don't end up falling short of your potential. It's like, that's exactly when you can achieve your potential, because you're no longer fighting this pointless struggle to like get your arms around everything and do everything and live every life that could theoretically be open to you. So, I'm sort of repeating myself, but that's always my pitch. It's like, to do the things that we think of as breaking through limitations and achieving the impossible, it actually, the first step of that is to fully accept those kinds of limitations that you're actually never going to break through, which are, you can be in one place at one time, you have a human body and human time, and one day you're going to die, which none of us wants to accept. And I think deep down, probably that's why we're engaged in all this.
Often
All this stuff, right?
productivity maxing is related to maybe a fear of death or a fear of the limited time that we do have. And the
Yeah.
whole title of the book that I read and certainly had the most impact of yourself is 4,000 weeks. And
Yeah.
that's striking that you have only 4,000 weeks on the planet. And I really like that was the metric that you chose to talk about, because you could have done it in days, you could have done it in hours, you could have done it in years. But I don't think 80 years or 85 years, however many weeks that works out as, has quite the same impact as weeks, because we can really picture how fast weeks go by. I mean, for example, we're recording this just over halfway through 2024. I can't believe we're in July in 2024.
Right.
Like, it terrifies me, because like 2023 was a matter of weeks ago, it seems like. But we really are on a
Yeah.
we're hurtling forward at a pace. And I think when you conceptualize that we have a limited amount of time in it, and that time on average is 4,000 weeks, maybe we are more purposeful with how we spend some of those weeks, rather than maybe wishing them away to a future time when such and such is the case. And I think, like, as you say, it marries really, really nicely. And we've mentioned the word optimize so far already. There's a trap that you speak about known as the efficiency trap. How would you describe that to the listener?
Yeah, so I think that the efficiency trap really is just the idea that, and it goes by other names in other fields of study and stuff, but like, it's just the idea that if all you do to try to get on top of an overwhelming workload, or improve your skills or your energy levels or whatever it is, if all you do is optimize, try to get more efficient, try to fit more things into the same amount of time, more capacity into the same amount of time, then all else being equal, you'll just get busier and more stressed and spend more time on things that don't really matter. So the example that I always give, because it's pretty vivid, at least people of my generation, is email, right? If you feel overwhelmed by email and you resolve to, like, okay, enough, I'm going to get on top of this, I'm going to deal with it, and you spend like 3 days just hammering through your email backlog or whatever it is, all else being equal, you'll just end up having more email than before, because you're replying to more people and they're replying to you, and then you got to reply to them, and you get a reputation for being really responsive on email, so more people email you. And that might be something you have to do in your job. It might be something you want to do in your business in terms of being customer facing. But what it isn't is a path to peace of mind, because the sort of general rule here is that if you take any system with a finite capacity, like a human being or your personal productivity, and the incoming supply of things is basically infinite, number of things you could read, number of emails you could get sent, number of goals you could pursue, the more you get through that supply, you're never going to get to the end of it, because it's an infinite supply, right? So you're just going to feel like more is passing through you. And I think that the real problem there is that it functions as a way of avoiding tough choices, right? The idea that you're going to be able to get on top of everything and do everything, it might feel like you're being really powerful and superhuman, but it's really a way of convincing yourself that you don't have to, like, say, okay, well, what are my priorities? What friendships am I going to let go in order to focus on other ones? What life ambitions am I going to put on hold, at least for now, in order to focus on other ones? Nobody wants to do that, because it's painful and it involves loss and disappointment and the risk of making the wrong choice and all this. So instead, we're like, I will just go all out on finding a way to do them all, and
Keep loading more and more onto the plate.
right, and it can't work. It's stress inducing, and ultimately it is just antithetical to what it is to be a human, I'm afraid.
I think one of your most striking ideas, and one that's been parroted and repeated on many, many podcasts, and I'm a big admirer of Chris Williamson. In fact, he was the first guest on my show to help me launch it, and he's done tremendously well. And he speaks a lot around how instructive it is that you encourage people to choose what they're going to fail at. And that links there to exactly what you've just said. If we assume that we're going to be good at everything and on top of everything and dialed into everything, and if something else comes along, yeah, we're going to load that in as well, we set ourselves up for complete failure, or at least maybe failure at some point down the line. We might be able to balance it for a little while, and then we burn out, or then we become fatigued, we become disillusioned. And
Right.
that is so common for people who are maybe going all out in so many particular areas, and then eventually they hit a wall and they become not good at anything. And it's
Right.
like, oh, well, why did you not just, and this sounds easier said than done, why did you not decide, okay, this is just not going to be something that I can excel at?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good. I mean, I'm going to pass the credit back to the person I first heard about it from, is a writer called John Acuff. But the idea of choosing what to fail at, I think it's important to say that this can be kind of like episodic or seasonal, right? It doesn't have to be like I am now giving up on the idea of, I don't know, becoming a writer, having a YouTube channel, running a marathon. Like you don't need to give up on it forever. It's just that like we have this great tendency to be like, all these things matter to me, and therefore there must be a way of fitting them all into my present life. And I can't tell you how many times earlier in my adulthood, especially when I was writing the Guardian column, I would like get these self-help books on goal setting, and they would all basically tell you to figure out like everything you really care about in your life, and then promise you some way that you could have these like, and you'd end up with like 18 big goals for the next quarter or something, and take about 24 hours to become totally depressed by the prospect of ever getting through these. And I think what you need to do instead, and I'm a work in progress, still have to learn to do this myself, is to say like, for the next however long, year, 90 days, whatever, however you're doing this, I want to try to do this and this and this. But these other things, even though they really matter and I care about them, are not for now. So, I'm not going to advise anybody to like stop exercising entirely, but maybe the next quarter is not the one where you have incredibly ambitious fitness goals. Maybe like you really want to improve your social life, but actually the next quarter is not the time when you're going to be doing that. And I feel like we've persuaded ourselves that we first of all have to convince ourselves that goal doesn't matter in order to put it on the back burner. But
We
you don't.
rubbish it.
It really matters, and you just won't do them all, and life will be worse as a result. So I think that sort of there's a self-trust involved, isn't there? Because I think some people, I was like this, think like, well, if I put that onto the back burner for the next 90 days, I might just forget about it entirely and wake up 3 decades later with no friends or no fitness or whatever. Firstly, that's not going to happen. Secondly, if you need to, like, put a physical thing in your year planner or your online calendar, that says 4 months later, like, review this thing, think about whether I want to change, that's fine. But just let yourself, for the next bit of time, focus on, it's different between people, but like 2 or 3 or 4 things in your life instead of 12 or 15 or 30.
One of the best things I've done off the back of that concept is accepting that there will be times when some things we in what I call maintenance mode. So you can use back burner, whatever you want to do. Equally, back burner for me makes me think of it being turned off, but
Right.
albeit you're almost keeping it on the boil a little bit.
Right.
But for me, having maintenance mode for particular things. So I think the fitness example is great. For example, I've trained with a bodybuilding style for a very, very long time. And I know that to maintain muscle takes an awful lot less volume and intensity than to build it. So when I decide that I'm going to go through a building phase, I know it's going to require more time, more energy, more commitment, more focus. But if I'm just maintaining, I'm quite happy with how I look just now and I can just coast along, then I probably don't need to train as often. So that frees up an extra day where I can spend it on something else, whether that's the podcast, whether that's my sales career, whether that's socializing. That means that that's almost like freed up some additional units of energy that I can assign towards that. And having gone through, I would say, very mild burnout at the end of 2021, I always think about having 100 units of energy that I can allocate, and having these dials on a dashboard that I can turn up or down. And when I went through the burnout, I 100% had everything turned up full that I normally do. But then I started socializing more and I was out later and I wasn't getting as much sleep as I had. So I just couldn't recover. So my 100 units maybe became 90 or 85. But guess what? Everything was turned up so much that I just got to a position where I was like, okay, I'm actually a bit fucked here, to be honest. And I've bitten off more than I can chew.
Yeah.
And I really think that accepting that there's particular things on this dashboard or on these dials that are actually almost at zero or very, very low is okay periodically, depending on what you care about.
I think it's really true. And I think people really need, I think it feels almost a taboo or illicit, right? Because it's like you're taking something that we all agree is essential. If not bodybuilding, then certainly staying fit and healthy, and sort of giving it a low priority in your life. But I think the idea that I've really come to, maybe even a bit since writing 4,000 Weeks, is that, the aggregate benefit over the course of a life is greater that way. So to give a really talk about things you're never supposed to put on a back burner, right? I've got a 7-year-old son. I really, by and large, love spending time with him, and definitely it's a huge priority in my life, even when I don't necessarily love it, that he should get a lot of my time and attention. obviously I'm never going to spend 3 months not paying him any attention. That doesn't work like that. But actually, if I can say to myself, you know what, for the next 2 weeks, and with my wife's agreement, of course, like for the next 2 weeks, this really is going to be a heavy work time. I'm not going to beat myself up for being a little bit, um, absent from things. But then I'm going to really make sure for another like couple of weeks that the balance is switched back. Overall, from that 4 week period, he does better than if I spend the whole 4 weeks thinking that I'm sort of somehow able to give my all to both of these areas. So like, actually, I believe, maybe I'm just justifying myself, but I believe I'm a better parent by sort of being willing to sift out those modes and say, yeah, I'm not going to be my best parenting self for a couple of weeks or even a month, but it's all part of a wider approach that gives really focused time to that.
I think it's a
That
very
role later
helpful
on.
example to give, Oliver, and I think it's a hard one to admit to as well, because you get some people who say, "Oh, that's ridiculous. Why on earth could you do that?" But as you say,
To be fair, no day goes by when an hour or two I'm not involved in the work of parenting, but it's a question of the difference between an hour or two or like 6, 7, 8, 9 hours.
exactly that. And one of the things that I've really been compelled to do is making sure that the time that I do assign to something is spent fully in it.
Mm-hmm.
So I suppose if you have this admission or agreement within your head and with your wife that over the next 2 weeks, I'm going to be a little bit less available than normal to pick up some of the duties that I normally would, when you do have the time within the 2 weeks to do the parenting thing, you are fully there and you're not maybe thinking about the workload that you've maybe put off to do that. And that for me can be transferred into many different areas. Like if, for example, I'm sitting within a dinner and I know I've got a podcast with Oliver Burkeman or David Robson or somebody the next day, and I'm not fully prepped for it, I'm not going to enjoy that social event. I'm going to be like, right, okay, I could probably do with reviewing that chapter again because I really want to ask Oliver about that. And I sit there at the dinner table and I'm not present. I'm not enjoyable to be around. I don't really get the fulfillment from it. Whereas if I just said, okay, because I've got this batch of interviews coming up, I actually probably can't go to a couple of dinners for a couple of weeks. But then when I'm back on top of my recording schedule, I'll be out on the Wednesday evening for dinner with friends. I'll go out on the Thursday to mini golf or bowling or whatever it is, and I'll be fully there and I will fully enjoy it and I will be a contributing member rather than this kind of half-empty shell that rocks up and shows face and all. But
absolutely. I think that's exactly right. Yeah, no, totally.
Yeah, I think deciding what to fail at is one of my favorite things that we can do. Just last on the efficiency trap, there's a quote that I wrote down from Jim Benson that you share around the more efficient you become a limitless reservoir for other people's expectations.
Right.
And I think that relates really strongly to what you said around email, because I pride myself on being somebody that's really on top of things. I'm a great communicator, both in my day job and in the podcast side of things. And even on like Instagram DMs from listeners, I feel like I'm really a good responder. But by being known as a good responder, people have that expectation that I'm really hot on my response. So if comes a time when I'm not, it maybe burdens me a little bit more. And I'm like, oh God, they're going to think I'm blanking them, or they're going to think I don't care about the fact that they really enjoyed that episode, or that I'm trying to get scheduled for whatever. And I do think that with your actions, you do shape others' expectations for how you're always going to behave. And you really need to make pronounced changes if you're going to shift away from that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, I mean, it's all a question of staying connected to what your values are, right? Because it's taken me a long time, but I'm sort of shifting gradually towards attempting to make sort of appointments for interviews and other things like in certain zones of my calendar wherever possible, and sometimes it isn't possible, sure, but I'm trying to sort of create these containers where once the container is full, maybe I can't do it that week, and the result is to sort of mean that I can, I sort of limit the this is something that Cal Newport talks about a lot, right? Sort of creating sort of fixed volumes in your life, and then letting them fill, and then they're full. On the other hand, I actually, on the same topic of email, I had this realization sort of a year ago now that the part of my work where I correspond with readers of the book and readers of my email newsletter by email is actually I really love, and I'm sure from what you say you really love it too. It's like it's not I don't necessarily want to optimize that out of my life, right? If I was paying someone to respond to those emails on my behalf, I would have basically outsourced some of the actual, for me, meaning of what I'm doing, rather than the things that I should be outsourcing, which are the things that I would rather not be doing
It's energy boosting
myself.
activities.
Right.
There's that whole. I got the idea from Sahil Bloom when he came
Yeah.
on the podcast to talk about energy calendar. So this is colored green, this is colored red, this is colored amber.
Yeah.
Replying to DMs and support about from podcast listeners is a green activity, because I'm like,
Yeah.
oh great, like somebody
Yeah.
listened to an episode from April 2020. Oh my goodness, that's
Yeah.
unreal, and they got this from it.
Yeah.
That boosts me in the same way somebody says, Oliver, finally got around to reading 4,000 Weeks, and you'll never guess I've done this, and you're like, wow, okay, well I better put pen to paper on this next book, because it's just that extra little push in the right direction.
Yeah, and it's just, it is that, and it's also just lovely, right? I mean, it's just straightforwardly great to, I've got an ego, and it's nice to know that things I've written have made a difference to people. So, that's not you still got to contain it, but I mean, I suppose the point about the Jim Benson quote that sort of began this bit of our conversation is that if all you do is try to process incoming things, you become a limitless reservoir for other people's expectations. And that can be, I sort of pushed back in the specific email example, I guess, because I think because of what I enjoy about that. But that's absolutely true everywhere else, right? If all you're doing is saying, if you get so efficient at saying, being able to handle things that you can say yes to everything, then you're never looking at a new incoming thing and saying, is this worth my time? You're just saying yes, and then the natural course of events, nobody involved in the process has to be being a jerk, just the natural course of events is that you will end up doing more and more and more stuff that you didn't make a deliberate conscious choice to have in your life.
Do you have some questions or frameworks that somebody could use to assess whether something new coming in is something they should be considering letting in, or perhaps saying no to?
I've thought about this a lot, and I've sort of encountered various great heuristics and rules of thumb. The one that springs to mind right now is hell yes or no, the Derek Sivers idea. There are a whole bunch of other things like this. More and more, I think it is a matter of intuition, and it is a matter of being willing to trust to a feeling that doesn't even exist at the level of questions and stuff. So one that I do that can be put into words and that I write about, probably more for big life choices than for tiny demands in the course of the working week, but is this idea from James Hollis about whether a choice would enlarge you or diminish you, right? Is something sort of taking you in the direction of growth and generativity and creativity, or is it taking you in the direction of sort of like shriveling and getting smaller and that's really useful for me. It's been really useful for me because it's not the question, is this fun or not, right? Some things are not fun and you do want to do them because they matter. Some things are fun, but actually they're a waste of time and it would be great to do fewer of them. So it's not always the case that like, is this fun? Or do I want to do this? For most of us, it can be a confusing idea because like, well, do I want to? Not really, but do I want to please that person, or do I want the benefit? Maybe. So I think this idea of like, does it enlarge me or diminish me is a really helpful one, because it enables you to see like, okay, that's the kind of unpleasant task that I just don't want in my life. That's the kind of unpleasant task that I want to do, even though it's unpleasant, because it matters to me to do things like that.
Because I know what's going to come off the back of it potentially, and it's going to be important for the larger picture, the enlarged picture.
Right, absolutely. And even the experience of it can be sort of engrossing, even if it's not fun, right? So it can be, there are lots of things you can do in creative work, certainly in parenting, that are like, no, if someone stopped you and said like, are you having a really good time right now? The answer would be no. But if they asked you, like, are you in the right place? Are you doing the right thing with your short time on earth? You'd be like, of course. Yeah, no, absolutely. And then I think the other thing is just, and I've got this crops up in a number of sources I've been reading and written about, but like, is just the idea of like aliveness. Like, is there life in this? Is there that sort of undefinable thing that makes this feel alive for me. And I find that surprisingly useful, given that it's so vague. And I think just quickly, one of the objections that people come up with is like, well, yeah, but some things you just have to do. You just have to respond to an email. You just have to fulfill certain duties. And, to some extent, that's true. And if you just have to, then you're just going to, and the issue doesn't arise. But I also think that the more you can be in this intuitive mode about making choices, the more you find like actually you do want to basically keep your commitments. You do want to pay your bills. You do want to not let the closest people to you down. It comes naturally, right? Very few of us are kind of like sociopathic, like horrible people who would take advantage of everyone in our lives the moment we got the opportunity to. Most of us, if we just sort of calm down and make a sort of reasoned, self-friendly decision, friendly to ourselves kind of decision about what we want to do, we'll find that, yeah, you do want to do most of those things that you've promised people or that are part of being a sort of upstanding member of society.
I think it's a great filter, and I think it's a really useful one, and it's maybe quite deep for somebody who's not thought on that level previously, and maybe they have just thought through, is this something I want to do? Is this a hell yes or a hell no?
Mm-hmm.
And when you maybe go to that deeper level, I think that's where you start to unlock more of the things that really matter to you, and you can make more meaningful choices off the back of Oliver. Another idea that I've always written down from you, and it's in my Apple Notes on several occasions, is this idea of starting the day with productivity debt and just how negative that can be for the kind of people that listen to a podcast like this one who are really aspirational and they know there's a lot that's coming within the day before they've even put their feet on the floor out of the bed.
Yeah, no, so this was an idea that sort of came into focus for me a few years ago, and it was like so clear that I had been in this mindset, this idea of being in productivity debt. So the basic idea, just quickly, is that, yeah, so many of us sort of get up in the morning with this sense that, yeah, something's not right. We're in debt in terms of productivity, and the job of the day is to like work really hard so that if you're lucky, you might get back to a zero balance and be able to say, okay, everything's all right now.
Cost neutral.
Right, exactly. As opposed to, what if you started the day thinking like, I don't have to do very much today, but I might choose to do a lot and sort of go into credit instead of just like getting back to zero balance. And I think this really brings in, again, just to get a bit sort of therapy-ish about it, I think this really brings in the topic of like self-worth and self-esteem, because what is really happening a lot of the time, and might be a difficult idea for some people listening to this, to watching this, to accept, but I would just urge you to entertain it, is that sometimes precisely the most driven people, the people who are most committed to like doing important, successful, difference making things in life, are on some level doing it to try to shore up a kind of feeling that they're not adequate or they're not okay as people. There's this great terrifying concept in psychology of the insecure overachiever, right? The person who like does a ton and is driven and everyone praises them for being so great, but ultimately they do it to try to like fill a void. And I don't know how much I count today, hopefully a bit less, but I've definitely been that person, right? And so the productivity debt thing is like you entangle this question of doing cool things in the world with like feeling okay about yourself. And I think there is a possibility, it's hard and difficult and there's not a quick fix for it, but there is a possibility instead of coming to believe like, okay, I'm completely fine as I am, I'm a fully adequate person, I have a right to exist if I spend the rest of my life like being a total waster, and I'm not going to do that because it would be really fun to create some cool things, to write some books, to launch a business, to have an amazing relationship, whatever it is. Not because I will be gradually shoring up my internal sense of okayness, but just because I'm fine. And now let's use this life in a fun and exciting way.
Yeah, I think there's lots of language around that people would find challenging if you use some of the maybe more stereotypical language, like "you are enough as you are,"
Right,
and
right.
people like me bristle maybe when they hear that. And like,
me too.
really? I mean,
Right,
I'm not really sure that's how I define myself.
Right.
But I certainly think that many of the times when I've been the most driven and the most aggressive in pursuit of the goal, it's been to fill some sort of void at times. And that can be a really powerful driver for the short term, but
Yeah.
it shouldn't last for a long, long time. Like you can be really driven by spite. For
Yeah.
example, oh, he'll never amount to anything with that podcast is, and you're like, right, fucking watch me.
I'm
Right,
gonna
here we
show,
go.
yeah, right, yeah.
Exactly. So and that can be helpful. But if that becomes the only driver for a really, really long period of time, I think that's where somebody becomes unfulfilled. They're doing things that aren't meaningful to them,
Yeah.
as you were kind of hinting at how important that is. So I completely agree and understand that we just need to have a slightly more meaningful definition of why we do the things that we do, rather than it's going to make me feel like I'm a valid person that can contribute to society. Like, we can definitely contribute as we are, but let's choose to do things that are really meaningful for us and those around us.
I think that's a really good point. And actually, what you say there about how short term the sort of those how short lived those kind of other motivations are, it really reminds me of it's a famous quote from Carl Rogers, the founder of humanistic psychotherapy, I think, who said that I'll try and get this quote right. The curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change. So there is this kind of close linkage between not needing to do stuff in order to prove yourself and actually being able to do it the most energetically and freely and successfully. There's one other line while I'm quoting quotes from, I think it's probably Shunryu Suzuki, but certainly some Zen guy who famously addressed an audience and said something along the lines of, each of you is perfect just as you are, and you could all use a little improvement. And I think that sort of holding that paradox is so powerful, because it's like, no, you don't need to launch a big business. You don't need to make millions. You don't need to be like incredibly like strong and muscular. None of this. You don't need to do any of these things. And actually, the more you can give up the idea that you need them in this existential sense, the more you can just do them because they're fun to do, and plow your energy into them and really like be there for them, instead of always having this other agenda of like, okay, have I reached adequacy yet?
Have I validated myself
Right,
as a valuable cog in the machine, or have I
right,
validated myself as
right.
somebody that actually matters? It's that balancing act that we've been talking about for the whole podcast.
Yeah,
I guess. Linked to the productivity deck, one of the really practical tools that I learned from you was a done list rather than a to do list. When
right.
did you start to implement that?
I've had some version of this on and off for like years now, probably like, I don't know, 7, 8 years. I don't know. But it's not necessarily instead of a to-do list. I mean, my systems of task management and project management are like constantly changing. And actually a big liberation for me was when I realized that was fine if they constantly change, and that you don't need to like find the silver bullet of productivity and then stick
I'm
with it.
doing Pomodoros and that's it, and
Right,
nothing else
exactly.
ever
Yeah.
again.
No, it's so liberating to be like, actually, this is a time when Pomodoros will be really useful. And if they stop being useful, I will stop doing them. But the done list part of that is, just the idea of having a list that you write what you have completed on, so that it gets longer during the day. If you're using some kind of digital task manager, you might automatically create one of these, because they have sort of logbook sections and stuff where completed tasks stack up. The sort of deeper meaning of that, I think, is that we instinctively compare whatever we've done in a day when we're sort of making these judgments of whether we're good enough people or not. We instinctively compare what we've done to like everything we could in theory have done, and you are never going to end up with a pleasing, self-esteem boosting result from that comparison, because obviously the amount you could in principle have done is infinite, and probably you've done like 8 things or something with the day. So I think the really powerful thing about a done list is that it prompts you to make a different comparison, and to compare what you've actually done today to what would have happened if you'd done nothing today and just stayed in bed, and then there would be nothing. And instead, there's all these items on the list. So it's very sort of motivating and encouraging, and it reminds you that you have actually done a whole lot of stuff, and that your sense that you haven't done much of what there is to do is quite deceptive because there's an infinite amount to do, so you are not going to have done much of it in any given day. And the other thing that I think is great about this approach, when you find yourself in a real sort of motivational meltdown, if you're in a really bad spot, you can just put literally anything on that done list, right? You can put, I made a cup of coffee on a done list. You can put, I had a shower. And it seems silly, but actually when you're in that kind of depressed place, watching that list of like, being a functional human being, mount up can be really helpful and very swiftly snowball into like, okay, now I'm actually doing, more significant things than
more higher leverage tasks. Yeah, I
Yeah.
certainly found that helpful during the pandemic, during the kind of more strict periods of the lockdown, just to put things that I was actually doing, because you could literally be like, sat at my desk for 8 hours, did like really, really, really like kind of pretty low level tasks that didn't feel particularly contributory towards anything major. But once you start to write things down, you also check in on yourself as a little bit of accountability to be like, well, I probably want to write something good on this list, or I want to write something that means something on this list. So for example, if I'm writing out the outline for one of the sales modules that I'm delivering as a training course, then I probably want to have something to write down on the Monday evening when I'm reviewing back on what I've done. Whereas if I look back and I don't have that written down, I'm kind of like, oh, well, that's a little bit disappointing. And it's a nice level of disappointment myself rather than like a berating myself.
Yeah.
Equally, I reflect on all the other things and I'm like, okay, well, actually, those were the priority today in terms of I trained, I recorded a podcast, I went for my walk, I called mom, I did the food shop. These are things that I write down. I'm like, well, actually, it's okay because those were the priority today. And there's still some, the whole classic, there's still some big rocks there rather than just little pebbles when it comes to productivity.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I think that there, it has many different benefits because it really brings your attention to what you're doing, but not in this kind of self-forcing way. Yeah.
Am I using the correct name for this when I call it the 333 method, or do you have a particular name or framework for it?
I called this the 333 method is something that I've written about. I was even from the first moment I wrote about this, I was like, this is just one way of thinking about structuring your day. I'm not even promising that I'm going to be using it like 2 months from now. So just like take this for what it's worth. But I think so it's a sort of rule of thumb for organizing your work day if you're someone like me, and I believe you, who has a lot of autonomy over how that day unfolds. But it also embodies some principles about how we structure our days that I think are really important. So I don't think the 333 method is really important, but I think the principles are really important.
Okay.
And the idea that I was getting at with the 333 method is just to say, one could aspire most normal days of your life when there aren't sort of very big unusual events happening, to spend 3 hours working on your sort of core creative stuff, whatever the real heart of your work is, to do sort of 3 things that I very loosely and deliberately vaguely call maintenance activities, which could be like staying on top of your email or taking some exercise or making time to meditate or whatever that might be. And then just like 3 other random to-dos that have probably been knocking around on your to-do list forever, and it would just be really good to get them off your plate. So you think of like 3 hours, 3 maintenance activities, and 3 little tasks. And some people have found this useful, but as I say, and I would probably be more like successful if I claimed that this was like the silver bullet and that you could buy my $5,000 course on the 333 method.
Well, it would need to end, it'd be 4997, I think, Oliver. It would have to end in a 7.
Oh yes, okay, right, okay, yes, 4997. But I just don't care as much about, and I've learned that the individual techniques one uses are less important than the principles underlying them. And I think the principle underlying this one is that it's actually really sort of modest, right? I think a lot of people's response to this is like, well, I can't get away with that. I've got to do many more things than that in the course of a day. And something that I've learned, I think the hard way, is that like, yes, on some level, I'm always going to think I've got to do much more than any approach that I implement for getting things done. But but I just won't. And I certainly won't get the right things done if I take a much more ambitious approach. And if I can sort of take, and the other thing about this approach, right, is that it takes, if you think about it, it's going to take you maybe 5 hours total, maybe 6 to do this. So hopefully, if you've got a working day of like, you might have 8 hours or 9 hours free for your working day. It's not trying to fill up all that time. So in all these different ways, it's like, it's not trying to account for absolutely everything. And I think what you learn if you follow some sort of organizational principle like this for a few weeks is that it is just a way more productive way to live than the one that says I'm going to squeeze maximum output out of every moment. You don't get into a fight with yourself in the same way. It's just like, okay, this is doable, and I can expect it to be doable tomorrow, and I can expect it to be doable the day after that.
It's called
And
longevity.
right, 2 or 3 weeks of doing the doable every day, and you've like done so much more than what I would have done in the past, which is like a really ambitious plan. Maybe for 2 days you bust through it and you're feeling great, and then you're just exhausted and annoyed, and you don't do it again because it's like, feels like a prison now. It's like, what, I've got to do this whole thing every day? Like, screw you, even though the person you're yelling at is yourself. So it feels a bit indulgent, and then, you know, very driven people are like, I don't want to be indulgent, I don't want to go easy on myself. But actually it isn't, you know. It's like,
If I spend 3 hours on the main thing every single day, I
yeah,
can really move the dial in the right direction, because it's 3 good hours and it's the thing. And there's so many different tasks that can be within the
yeah,
thing. But I really think that even in employment, if you spend 3 hours on the main project that
yeah,
your employer and you are working on right now, you're probably going to see some pretty significant results. And I say this to a lot of some of the young sales guys that I've given some coaching to over the last little while. If you spent 3 hours doing really good high quality prospecting like a day, you're doing more than most people actually in terms of like quality work get across a week easily, because they're just in and out of micro distractions the whole time.
I think that's totally true. And it also makes me want to say that, like, I started this little bit by saying this is for people who have a lot of autonomy over their day. If the focus of your sort of creative or business ambitions is outside of your day job, then, you know, 333 is not going to be realistic. But that's fine, because 1 hour done over, you know, I want to say consistently, but I want to say something about consistency in a moment as well. I think you know, an hour a day or even less done basically consistently for a while will just blow your socks off in terms of like what will have been done, compared to thinking about how soon you're going to take 3 days off and do 15 hours a day, right?
And
Because
we give our future selves so much credit for how disciplined and dialed in we're going to
we're
be
going
and
to
how
be right,
capable
exactly.
we're going to be.
Right, exactly. No number of hours of work make any difference if they're all hypothetical. And you know, the only thing I want to say about that as well, and I've got a little bit on this in my forthcoming book, is that you can turn consistency into a sort of way of berating yourself and making life miserable, and getting into a sort of struggle with yourself that doesn't help with productivity as well. If you really tell yourself it's got to be every single day, and you're a huge failure if one day the motivation just isn't there, or things happen in your life and you can't do it. I love this idea from Dan Harris, who runs the 10% Happier meditation podcast and app, of doing things daily-ish, because that is not actually just doing it when you feel like it, right? Daily-ish, you know, like if your goal is to sort of meditate, and that's where it comes from originally, daily-ish, and you do it twice in a week, like, you know, you didn't meet that standard. But if you did it 5 days, you do know that you met it. And some busy times, maybe 4 days is going to be able to count as day. So, you know, it's a vague standard, but it's not no standard. And I think that is actually a really helpful way to think about some of these things, to say, like, I'm going to hold myself to a standard, but it's not going to be this absolutist standard where everything's ruined the first day that, you know, I'm not feeling like it.
Of course, Oliver, I found 4,000 weeks to be really impactful on somebody like me who is go, go, go and push, push, push. And it made me consider a lot of things from a meaningful perspective. I think I was getting there, but like many great resources, it came along at the right time and kind of pushed me towards where I should be. And there's definitely times where I still spend time on things that maybe I should have said no to, and maybe I should have decided I was going to fail at it. But I am quite ruthless in saying no to particular activities or jaunts or ventures that I know just won't fit within the mug that I'm forever pouring coffee into the top of. What's coming next? You've hinted at your next work. What's on the way for us?
Thank you for the opportunity to be self-promotional. I'll keep it brief. I've actually, it's going to lean off. This is the American cover, so it's not the British one. Looks different, but this is called Meditations for Mortals: 4 Weeks to Embrace Your Limitations and Make Time for What Counts. This is a paperback galley copy. It's not. It's going to be a hardback book when it comes out in the autumn. But the idea here is that I really wanted to write something about action, about actually going from knowing what it is that you want to be spending your time on that would be meaningful and absorbing and make a difference, and to doing it. And so, based partly on some of the newsletters that I've written, this is it's got sort of 28 short chapters divided into 4 weeks. The idea, obviously I can't force anyone to read it in a particular way, but the idea is that you might go through it like a chapter a day for 4 weeks, and that the way these are meant to build on each other would sort of let these kind of different perspective shifts and these different tools, which are all about sort of actually getting around to what counts in a sort of limited context in which we find ourselves as humans, that they sort of build on each other. And in my dreams and my aspiration, stick and make a concrete difference, not turn into this thing. It's like, okay, great new productivity system. As soon as I get some free time in a few months, I'll put it into practice. But actually, in the moment and in the process of reading the book, become more open to taking action on the things that really count. So it's sort of a bit like a sort of retreat in your mind or something, for 4 weeks in the middle of daily life. That's my hope for this book.
I'm excited to see it and read it, and I'm sure many people will be scrambling to grab a copy of 4,000 Weeks, and I'm sure they'll be scrambling to grab a copy of your latest book when it's ready.
Well, it's pre-orderable now, and as you know very well, and everyone knows because authors are saying it all the time, pre-orders make a really outsized, disproportionate difference. So you'll be doing me a great favor if you do decide to pre-order it in any format. Yeah.
Thank you, Oliver. The link will be for the latest book in the show notes, and I'll link to your website as well. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to the listener. I'll be back to speak to you all again very, very soon.